It's time to count the cost. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and as we look back over what has certainly been the most extraordinary year for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world, whose lives have been utterly reshaped as a consequence of a global pandemic originating from China that has decimated the world economy and plunged tens of millions, some 90 million people, into abject poverty, less than $2 a day. Now, I want to today kind of paint the landscape as I see it in terms of the impact of the global economy, the shift in the balance of power, the extent to which we are likely to recover in 2021, and the kinds of transitions in everyday life that we will see as a consequence of that. Start with a silver lining. The depth of the global economic contraction has not been quite as deep as was projected in the middle of the year. The reason being that we now appear to have a safe, effective vaccine that is being distributed, at least to the Western countries. At the time of recording, some 500,000 people in the UK have already received the vaccine, and we can be hopeful that in 2021, the impact of COVID in a health sense will largely evaporate as the vaccine is distributed worldwide and the disease becomes largely, at least in the wealthy countries, eradicated. The financial impact, nonetheless, is still staggering. If we look at just some of the major economies, Italy has contracted 10.6% this year. The UK has contracted 9.8%. Same with France, identical, 9.8%. The Spaniards have fallen 12.8% in GDP. They did not come into this crisis well to begin with, having had several successive years of economic decline. And then what is perhaps the most remarkable, a growing, emerging economy of over 1 billion people, India has fallen 10.3%. In fact, global trade volumes have fallen 10.4% worldwide. The only major economy to have grown in 2020 is China, and that just continues to accelerate the global power shift towards this, behemoth authoritarian dictatorship that is bursting again, re-emerging onto the world stage. Beyond that, beyond those sheer numbers, the average national sovereign debt of countries around the world has increased by 20%. Inflation has decreased, which would make those debt servicings a little bit more affordable, but not as much as those debt levels have increased. And as the global economy starts to get back on its feet, those interest rates will rise rapidly and debt burdens will hamper economic growth and development. Global inequality has dramatically increased. One of the most eye-watering statistics that any of us kind of dealing with have to contend with is that 10 people in the world have increased their wealth by $450 billion this year, at a time when hundreds of millions of people around the world have been thrown out of work. In fact, those figures, particularly in the West, are hidden in many respects because people have shifted to a part-time, seasonal and insecure work, and also have various government programs concealing the fact that they're actually out of work and don't have a job to go back to. That's one of those aspects that I think in 2021 we're really going to start to feel the pain of that, as the actual data collection around this will need to improve to fully capture the impact of the pandemic in that respect. Some industries have been massively destroyed. So tourism has lost some $3 trillion worldwide this year. Many industries, whether it's arts, live shows, and entertainment, down some 70% in many places. Hotels, restaurants facing lockdowns and renewed lockdowns. Considerable degree of instability and insecurity. You come out of a lockdown, you then go, okay, well, now's the time to go and invest. I'm going to bring all the staff. I'm going to open my doors. And then you go back into lockdown due to a second wave or a third wave, destroying your confidence and throwing you into considerable personal debt. Obviously, various forms of transportation have been totally decimated. So air travel, cruise ships, all of those things have gone down some 70, 80, 90% in some cases. And hundreds of thousands of people have been, who only have highly specialized skills, who may never actually work in those industries again. It's not clear. These people who have never been unemployed before, who now face the genuine prospect of being long-term unemployed, having to completely reskill, and that reflects the age bracket who has been disproportionately economically impacted. That the biggest age bracket are the 25 to 44-year-olds, so people just on the cusp of their launching a major career. They've had their careers interrupted globally. So of all the different age groups, they're the ones that have experienced the greatest degree of financial loss as they have been thrown out of their jobs. They have large debt burdens already. Often they have mortgages, young families to look after, don't have the high degree of physical mobility to perhaps go where the jobs need to be, and yet have to often contribute most significantly to the tax base that governments use for their own spending. And that contraction has increased and accelerated government debt even further. Globally, 1.6 billion pupils have been directly impacted as a consequence of lockdown restrictions. And so for many students, it's up to a year of schooling just thrown out the window. It's unclear how they're ever going to make that up. And what the impact will be down the line for their university prospects, for their career prospects in the future. That's certainly going to impact their productivity, having this much time sort of restricted. And then there's going to be a degree of readjustment. Even as things normalize in 2021, it's not like everything just resumes from the day that they left. It's going to be, trying to normalize life again, make new friends, go back into an environment of learning. It's not something that just happens. I certainly wouldn't want to go back to high school, for example. And then there is the impact on very young children. Hundreds of millions of very small children around the world have not remembered a time really before the pandemic. If you're 3 or 4 years of age and all you've been able to do is wear a mask and be wrapped in cotton wool, well, that could have significant developmental implications for you long term. And then there is the teenagers, people who have trying to find their identity in this pandemic world, who will, be able to go on their sort of adventures around Europe or fall in love for the first time. People who just are struggling to separate themselves from their parents and yet are perhaps in a restricted lockdown environment, unable to engage in their recreational activities, unable to spend time with their friends, developing huge amounts of mental illness. And there was that video that I created where I just despaired of the proportions, the eye-watering proportions of young people who had contemplated suicide just in the last month. I think it was something like in the United States, 24% or even more, 40% of 18 to 25-year-olds having contemplated suicide this year. I'll leave a link to that video. That really rattled me to the core. And thus, we have to understand that these disruptions, these changes, have dramatically increased inequality, wildly shaped our psychology, and for decades to come, we will be feeling the economic impacts of this global economic suicide that we've had to invoke in order to lock down and save lives. Now, if the vaccines are as effective as everyone has said and that they're effectively distributed, I suspect that everyday life will get back to normal quite rapidly in 2021. That probably, certainly by April, May of next year, most things will have opened up again. There'll be plenty of job opportunities, plenty of investment opportunities, and there'll be a degree of normalcy and relief, and people will start to think about the world beyond and hopefully be able to plan more long term for the future. One of the things that I've said in my government life is that 5 years ago, it was much easier to plan 5 years in the future than it was sort of mid-year planning 6 months in advance. The degree of uncertainty, of short-term thinking, of immediate crisis is something that we have as just people in a highly stable Western environment have not had to contend with for many decades. And that degree of acute crisis is quite new for people. I think it's quite healthy in some respects. We had to be shaken out of some elements of complacency, but I don't think that the social dislocations, the political unrest, the revolutions and significant political change has yet to take effect. That historically usually is about 2, 3, 4 years after an event like this. So I think that in 2022, 23, we are going to see some dramatic political shifts. It's too early to say exactly how that'll fold, but I would say watch this space. And then certainly this pandemic is just yet another example of where China, at least domestically, has pulled through more effectively than the liberal West. I think China is taking the very wrong lessons from that. It's not because they have a superior system. It's just because they have a more autocratic system. And that is going to just lead to greater confidence, greater overconfidence, more assertiveness, and greater tension with the United States. So we're now 2 for 2 with China. There was the global financial crisis in which China pulled through faster and more rapidly, more aggressively than the West. And in that, creditors were creditors due. I think at that time, China really did do better in terms of their fiscal policy. But now that they've created this virus and distributed it around the world, and they're being the fastest to recover, well, the reason for that isn't because they have, superior infrastructure or systems or anything. It's just they have a dystopian social credit system and a government that has omnipotent power over the population. And those lessons that are being learned, not only by China, but by some other sort of autocratic powers around the world, that will become, I think, an ideological challenge. The idea that government should have increasing control over our own lives. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of that in the West. I do agree that in the states of emergency, in truly acute crises, government should have extraordinary powers, but those powers should be time limited. They should revert back to the long-standing norm, and people afterwards should take account of the decisions that were made at that time. And to the credit of the Australian government, I find, and this is just a bit of an aside to finish up, all of the decisions that were made while I was in government and dealing with COVID issues were tracked, recorded, and explained for future audit purposes. But if you're in, China or Turkey or Russia, those things are unlikely. And so I think we're going to see a higher degree of corruption with massive capital shifts that have occurred during this pandemic, where there has not been as much transparency of decision making. Huge sums of money have been moved. Like as I speak today, some $900 billion in a COVID relief package was announced that Trump is threatening to veto. But what's in the relief package is not just money for people. In fact, it's a mere $600 a household. Instead, it's hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to military aid, pet projects, pork barreling. Like all of these things, a 5,600-page bill to articulate this, where everyone in Congress had about 4 hours to read it before the vote. It's these kinds of things that are being pushed through during these emergency pandemic atmosphere that we're going to be living with for the years and decades to come, and will facilitate the political unrest and change that I alluded to before. I think that truly interesting years are ahead of us. The next 3, 4, 5 years in terms of the global economy, in terms of everyday social life, in terms of the developmental maladjustments of having to come out of this period, and the political rest and revolutions that we will see. Please stay tuned for that, because that's what we will be discussing in the years and months ahead. And I'll create another video on what I see as the main outlook for 2021, both for this channel but also globally. And please stay around for that. And please also, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We do want to grow it. It's been growing rapidly. We're very grateful for that. But if you found value in these discussions, consider sharing it in social media, discussing it with others, and certainly leave your comments down below. What do you think will be the major changes as a consequence of the global economy? Do you think that the recovery will be as rapid as, say, the IMF projections suggest, which is that we will get back to normal very quickly in the new year? And do you think it was all worth it? Do you think that having all of these global lockdown restrictions, given the fact that we've had a vaccine in global record time, which is a tremendous scientific and medical achievement, was it all worth it, or was this something that we would never do again? Very curious to know your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Thank you.